Hi everyone. So some thoughts to take us through some verses in the Bible together, or on your own, or perhaps to grab the phone and chat through with someone following the teaching we had on Sunday where Steve spoke with us about relationship breakdown, and how to love our enemies as well as loving those that we're in good relationship with as well. So some verses for us to look on. Colossians 3:12 to 14. I'll quickly read it, find it in my Bible. I'm not prepared for that, am I? Right, Colossians 3:12 to 14 says this: Therefore, as God's chosen people, holy and dearly loved, clothe yourselves with compassion, kindness, humility, gentleness, and patience. Bear with each other and forgive one another. If any of you has a grievance against someone, forgive as the Lord forgave you. And over all these virtues, put on love, which binds them all together in perfect unity. And then some other verses we'll pick up as well. 1 Peter 5:5 to 7. All of you clothe yourselves with humility towards one another, because God opposes the proud but shows favour to the humble. Humble yourselves, therefore, under God's mighty hand, that he may lift you up in due time. Cast all your anxiety on him, because he cares for you. Really challenging verses, and challenging on Sundays. We went through Luke 6, but it can be such a freeing way to live when we choose to live this way and choose to live thinking of others, and wanting to have good relationships with others. Steve used a phrase on Sunday that both he and I use a lot and try our best to live by. Some days easier than others. Refuse to be offended. It is a challenge, a real challenge to live that way, but can provide a life that feels a lot more alive, a lot more in abundance, as we're talking about in this series. And these verses in Colossians and Peter look a lot at how we live our lives, how our lives are seen maybe by others, by this idea of what we clothe ourselves with. And it's that place that our relationships flow from. What are the things we clothe ourselves with? What are the things we put on? What are the qualities that other people will see through us and see in how we live our lives? And Paul in Colossians lists those qualities as compassion, kindness, humility, gentleness, and patience, and then goes on to those verses about forgiveness. All things that God is calling us to live by. God is encouraging us to be how people see us in that way. And when we are in relationship breakdown with others, it is really difficult to live with compassion, to live with kindness, to live with humility, gentleness, and patience and forgiveness towards those people where relationship breakdown has happened with. And I think that's where this is just so challenging, isn't it? That we have to choose to live this way, choose to have these qualities, and not just in an appearance way on the outside. It's not just clothing that we put on the outside, it's clothing we put inside, on our hearts, in our hearts, our motives for how we're living and how we're being with other people. And then Peter picks up on this idea of clothing as well. And in those verses, he says, clothe yourselves with humility towards one another, but also before God. Wow, that's that's a challenge again, isn't it? To live that way. So what does it mean to live with humility, to humble ourselves before others? And there is a great quote by C.S. Lewis on what humility is, and I love these words. Humility is not thinking less of yourself, it's thinking of yourself less. Let me say that again. Humility is not thinking less of yourself, it's thinking of yourself less. That's incredible. I really love that. It's not about, humility isn't about us disregarding ourselves or putting ourselves down or thinking negatively about ourselves. Humility is about putting others first, putting God first. If we're humbling ourselves before him, humbling ourselves before others, not thinking of me, my rights, myself, how I'm feeling. It's thinking about others first, and then putting that other person first, and then dealing with my feelings, my thoughts, my rights, myself after that. There is a great fact out there that the average person thinks about 400 words a minute, thinks 400 words a minute. But the average person is only able to communicate, is only able to speak out 100 words a minute. So we are thinking 4 times faster than we're able to speak. I find that fascinating and so interesting, because we suddenly realise we feel we have something really important to say, really important response to give to someone. And what we realise with that fact is we're thinking so quickly, the words aren't going to come out as quick as we're thinking. And actually, if we're thinking about how we're going to respond to someone, are we actually hearing what that other person is saying to us? Knowing the very fact as well that they're going through that same process. So they're trying to communicate to us the 400 words that they've thought in just 100. And are we actually hearing what they're trying to say? It makes me realise how easy it is for us to misunderstand each other, for us to become offended, even if we are trying to live by that value of refusing to be offended, to completely miss the point of what someone is trying to say as they try to condense their thoughts as quickly as they can and communicate them out. We're already trying to think what our response is, and we haven't even heard properly what they're thinking or what they're trying to say to us. How much are we really listening to someone that we're in relationship with? Or how much is that time us just getting ready to speak, ready to offer them a response? And we go back to this idea of humbling ourselves before God, humbling ourselves before others, clothing ourselves in humility. That means we're thinking more of others. That means we should be ready to listen more to others before we jump in with what we want to say. I'm saying this to myself. This is something I am so bad at, that I'm ready with that response, or I'm ready to jump in, or I know what I think and I'm going to say it before they've even finished the sentence. Actually, these verses we've read in Colossians, in 1 Peter, and the message that Steve brought on Sunday should hopefully be encouraging us in how we communicate in our relationships, in how we can be more humble. What does that mean when we're listening, when we're talking with people? Is waiting, pausing, something maybe we're not very good at, not just rushing through, but being ready to reflect on what someone said, thinking of them, trying to think of where they're coming from by what they've tried to communicate, rather than us jumping in. And then we go back to those qualities that Paul put in Colossians of what we should be clothing ourselves with: gentleness, kindness, patience. Great qualities when we're trying to be more humble and humble ourselves in how we respond to other people. And then when we jump back to those verses in 1 Peter, after he encourages us to be humble, to not be proud. I mean, there's a whole nother thing we could look at on the opposite of being proud, on humbling ourselves. And Peter says these words: humble yourselves under God's mighty hand, that he may lift you up in due time. When we're living in a place of a broken relationship, or we feel like everyone is kind of taking from us and we're not receiving anything back, we're giving, we're not receiving, when we're feeling hurt by someone, when our relationship's feeling a mess, we can feel right at the bottom of the pile. And yet that verse there, what an encouragement. God will lift us up. God will raise us up when the time is right. And how do we know that? Because, as the next verse tells us, cast your anxiety on him because he cares for you. God cares for us. God doesn't want us to feel at the bottom of the pile. God doesn't ask us to humble ourselves so that we feel unworthy, so we feel at the bottom, so we feel like we're not worthy of people's time or good relationships. He encourages us to do that so he can rise up. And then God will raise us up so that God can be at the center of our relationships. And he can help us with this if we cast our anxiety, our worries on him. If we're worried for someone, worried about someone, worried about a relationship issue we've got, or just taking on that burden for someone else, then actually it means God can take care of that. God can take that burden off us. God can free us up. It means we can be fully alive and free in our relationships with others. And that can help us so much, so much. And then flipping back to Colossians, the last verse in there, after Paul has talked on what we want to clothe ourselves with, on living with forgiveness, he says, over all these virtues put on love, which binds them all together in perfect unity. Wow. Cover everything with love, knowing unity is going to come from that. What do we want in our relationships? We want unity, don't we? So as we show love to others in the way we forgive, in the way we humble ourselves, in the way we clothe ourselves with these incredible qualities, in the way we live out our lives as God's chosen and loved people, God will help bring unity. Unity doesn't mean we're all going to agree on everything. With all our friends, with all our family, with whoever we're in relationship with, there will be moments where we're not fully in agreement, but that doesn't mean we can't be united. It doesn't mean we can't act together and we can't act in showing God's love, because that is what God is calling us to. So I don't know about you, but I want to really encourage you with these verses today. They've encouraged me that as we live out our lives, as we work through difficult relationships, God is there with us. God tells us, give him our anxieties, our worries about them. And God will love us. He will care for us through them. And where connection has broken down, God can be there with us, helping us. And as we humble ourselves, be encouraged that God will transform our relationships. I hope that's been a real blessing, a real encouragement. In the written notes that have come out, there's some questions there you might want to have a look at yourself or with other people. But let's keep living these lives of humbling ourselves and being ready to see how God can transform our relationships. God bless and see you soon.